Hello YouTube. Want to go over a thing that is seldom discussed in history classes, and if it is discussed, it's discussed wrong. Which ended up being the first real attempt at gun control in the United States before there even really was a United States. It was actually when you still had colonies, and it was the attempt by the British to restrict the amount of arms the Native Americans had. This goes back to 1763. This is what led to what is known as Pontiac's Rebellion. In high school and in school, they tell you Pontiac's Rebellion was fought over land. It was not fought over land. It was fought over. It was literally fought over the policies that the British had towards the Native Americans. 1763, British General General Amherst. He was in charge of the military, helped win the war against the French with the Native American allies. Well, war's over, French lost. Now Amherst is being ordered by London, you will turn the Native Americans into loyal subjects, they will listen to us, they will do as they're told, and that's it. Well, how to do this? Well, they knew they could not take the guns away from Native Americans. There had been too much trade since 1601. Literally since 1601 was the start of the Iroquois Wars. The 1609 battle against the French by the Iroquois at the first Battle of Ticonderoga, where the Iroquois first experienced what it was like to be shot at by firearms. The French under Samuel de Champlain basically changed the nature of warfare of Native Americans in the entire Northeast. Because they completely were outgunned, outclassed, and the first thing Native Americans did, abandon their tactics, abandon their wooden armor, and the Iroquois went straight to the Dutch. We need guns. When the Dutch left, went to the British, we need guns. And that trade lasted right up until the American Revolution and went straight, except for this point in time here, for the time of Pontiac's Rebellion. So by 1763, the British knew they could not take guns away from the Iroquois and all the Native Americans. It was not going to happen. What they decided to do was limit the amount of ammunition they could have by restricting the powder and restricting lead. One of the things that Amherst said in a letter was, "I am fully convinced the only true method of treating these savages is to keep them in a proper subjugation." This was the beginning of it. The British head or superintendent of Indian Affairs was Sir William Johnson. Amherst wrote to Johnson, "Okay, you tell me what a typical Native American warrior uses for arms and ammunition for a year." He came back with, "Well, sir, it's basically roughly equivalent to 8 pounds of powder and 8 pounds of lead." Fine. Amherst's response was, "We're going to give them 5 pounds of powder and shot. That's it. That's all they're going to get." And the theory was, if they have just enough to get by, to live on, to hunt, to defend themselves from their other rival tribes, then they're not going to make trouble for us. Amherst held an extremely low view of Native Americans. He despised Native Americans, couldn't stand them, hated them with a passion. Basically, they were trying to reduce them to what was known basically a Stone Age existence. There was even some comments, "Well, why don't you go back to bows and arrows?" That was literally so the British could completely govern them. The acting New York governor at the time was a man by the name of Cadwallader Colden. And he said to Johnson, regarding Native Americans, they should know and feel that they cannot live without us. Basically, make them loyal subjects of the crown and they will do as they are told. Well, that didn't work. This is how Pontiac's Rebellion got started. The Native Americans promptly declared war on the British. Most of the tribes, the Senecas and several other tribes, lined up, basically formed a loose confederacy and went straight at the British. The Iroquois, except the Senecas, because the Senecas are part of the Iroquois Confederacy, the rest of the Iroquois kind of like, all right, we're going to stay over here and keep an eye on things. The British knew not to mess with them. The British knew under no circumstances touch the Mohawk, because the Mohawk were, during the entire 1601 to 1701 conflict among the Iroquois wars, the toughest and almost best armed force on the continent. The British were in total awe of the Mohawk. Rogers and his Rogers Rangers, Robert Rogers, learned his tactics from the Native Americans. The Native Americans changed their tactics to what they ended up becoming, was the brush warfare, because of the battle with the French in 1609. They literally, their tactics completely changed and adapted, and they became the most fearsome force. The Mohawk were the most fearsome force on the continent. The British knew, don't touch them. Leave them alone. That was the one tribe. The Iroquois, for the most part, were the one group. The British said, we're not going to mess with them. Yes, we're going to restrict their policy, but we're really not going to force it. William Johnson also knew better. Johnson, despite Amherst's orders, Amherst hated Native Americans. He viewed them very basically as cannon fodder. One thing Amherst wrote in the letter to Johnson was that Native Americans were the vilest race of beings that ever infested the earth, and whose riddance from it must be esteemed a meritorious act for the good of mankind. His orders to his soldiers were, take no prisoners, but put to death all that fall into your hands. That's how he viewed Native Americans. These were his former allies who helped him. If it wasn't for the Native Americans, for the Mohawk or Iroquois that fought with the British, the French would have walked all over them. And for the first couple of years, the French did exactly that. So, the Pontiac and the rebellion promptly kicked the living hell out of the British. Within a few weeks, all the Native Americans aligned to Pontiac, and with that loose confederacy, captured 8 British forts. Because what Amherst didn't realize is the Native Americans, he didn't realize how much powder and stores they really had from the war. They had kept thousands. One source put them as 10,000 pounds of powder alone in one tribe. They were very well stocked up. They just didn't like the fact that the British telling them what to do, and the fact that they viewed what Amherst and the British did as a complete insult and a total betrayal. And they were not about to stand for it. So that rebellion lasted for a couple of years. The only reason it lasted that long is Pontiac and his allies all thought the French were going to come in on their side. They thought that once the French king sees that we're fighting the British and we're holding our own and we've captured these forts, and when they captured the forts, they captured all the munitions in them. They stripped it bare, took it of everything. Johnson and the British that were actually in the field absolutely ignored Amherst's orders. They fought when they had to, but for the most part, they told the Native Americans, look, you want powder, we'll get you powder. You want guns? They actually was a black market. Johnson made money off the black market, trading whatever he could to the Native Americans, because he knew if we don't, we're going to get killed. They didn't know, we're not going to lose, we're going to die. And they knew that. Not to mention, they were, even despite the fact the French government was gone, there were independent French traders from Canada coming down to trade with the Native Americans who used to trade with the British. So now they were buying their guns off the French. And the French were more than happy to sell it to them. They were even getting guns from the Spanish as far south as Pensacola and into Florida. Because at that time, prior to the Louisiana Purchase of 1805, the Spanish controlled Louisiana and Florida. So the Native Americans were traveling as far south as there to get guns from the Spanish. They were literally coming back up to wage war on the British. It was a complete disaster for them. The Native Americans didn't lose. They gave up. They basically, once they realized the French were not going to help them, the Treaty of Paris was real, that they were not going to get any help from the French. They said, we're just, okay, we're going to go home and go back to our lives. It wasn't that they lost, it's that they gave up. There wasn't a defeat, a resounding victory by the British. The British literally, the French wasted a huge opportunity. The French had a chance to take the British out of North America, and they blew it. And by 1765, trade had been pretty much restored to what it was beforehand. The British were even Gage, were begging the Native Americans, look it, we screwed up, we'll trade with you again. They were giving them whatever gifts they could get, guns, powder, silver, blanket, everything they could give them, they were giving them. By 1765, in the Ohio River Valley, north of the Ohio River Valley, just that year alone, the trade amounted to 3,000 guns, 80,000 pounds of powder, and 160,000 pounds of lead. Just in the just north of the Ohio River Valley alone, that northeast quadrant. That is how much trade the British, and this was after they decided to, because the British government recalled Amherst, got him the hell out of North America, and brought him back over. Basically, get him out of there, because the Native Americans would love to have gotten their hands on him. The Iroquois, who had remained neutral, sided with the British, said, all right, we fought with them. They have never, well, with the exception of the Senecas, we fought with them. We're going to honor our deal, our agreements with the British. The Iroquois, for the most part, with the exception of the Senecas, did not want to break that agreement. They didn't like the idea of doing that. So that's why they stayed neutral and then eventually just sided with the British. That also helped change Pontiac's mind and a lot of these other tribes going, we don't want to take on the Iroquois and the British at the same time without the French backing us up. So more or less they all decided, okay, we're going to quit. A lot of people in history classes throw it out as the whole end of Pontiac's rebellion as what became known as the Parliament's Proclamation Line of 1763. Saying that the colonials could not settle west of the Appalachian Mountains. That area belonged to Native Americans. That did come about during Pontiac's rebellion, but it was actually being drafted up before the rebellion. Your history classes will teach you that that's what stopped the war. That is not what stopped the war. The Native Americans could care. They didn't care about settlers coming much farther west because nobody was going that way anyways when you had that rebellion on. They were not venturing forth, considering that the British were losing their forts. By 1764, the Native Americans had decided to give back most of them, but they pretty much, even the British didn't have the manpower to occupy their own forts again. They had too busy consolidating their bigger forts, Pitt and Detroit. The rest of the smaller ones they left alone because they knew we don't have the manpower for this. Their trading supplies were being ambushed on the way to the forts. A lot of them weren't even getting there. Native Americans were ambushing them and stealing whatever they had on their guns, munitions, everything, and killing anybody they ran across. The British were totally outmatched. If it wasn't for the fact the French completely missed the opportunity, that whole time period could have ended very differently for the British. But like every other form of gun control, it failed. But you can see that early attempt is what a lot of politicians are trying to do now. Ammunition. They know they can't take the guns away because there's just too many of them, but they can restrict the ammo. That's where you see like ammo background checks like here in New York. And now that's been introduced in the assembly, they want to do the lead ammunition ban. Basically that you have to use non-lead ammo on all hunting land. All state hunting land, which makes up a huge chunk of the land in the state as far as hunting goes. There is very, very little private hunting land left anymore. Very few people allow anybody hunt on their land because it has gotten so bad. Most of the land, the Adirondack Park, the Catskills, out west, is all state hunting land. There's millions of acres of it. That'll all be lead-free ammo only if this passes, and there's a very good chance it will. They will control the ammunition. That's how they're going to eventually get gun control through, is they're going to keep hammering the ammunition. It's just a matter of time. And they're trying to do what Jeffrey Amherst did. And don't think for a second that the politicians you see now don't have the same view of you as a conservative, as a gun owner, that Amherst had of the Native Americans. And with that being said, YouTube, have a good day.